If you picture a medieval knight riding into battle swinging a sword, you're already watching the Plan B. Most of the time, the real work was done with lances, spears, and long pole weapons, because reach wins fights, and armor changes everything. So why did the sword become the symbol of knighthood, even when it usually wasn't the main weapon? Number 1. The sword's real job. A knight almost always owned a sword, but on most medieval battlefields, the sword wasn't the first tool that did the heavy lifting. It was the weapon that stayed with you when everything else changed. When you went from horse to foot, when you were squeezed into a press of bodies, when your main weapon snapped, or when you needed something you could draw instantly. Medieval fighting was usually about groups, not neat one-on-one duels. And that changes what best weapon even means. Armies leaned toward tools that give reach, control, and simple teamwork, especially spears, lances, and long pole weapons. The sword sat in the background as the dependable backup that rarely got left behind. By head count alone, this matters a lot. Knights and men-at-arms were important, but they were never the whole army. In many periods, the practical knight on the field looks a lot like an armored rider with a spear and a shield, supported by other mounted and foot soldiers. Most people on a medieval field were infantry and support troops, and the most common weapons for them were long and practical. It also helps to remember what knight means in context. It's a social rank and a professional fighting role, not a promise that every fight looks like cinematic swordplay. Knights were wealthy enough to afford good equipment, trained from a young age, and expected to show up for war with a complete kit. That kit could include a lance for mounted shock, a spear or pole weapon for serious hand-to-hand, a dagger for extremely close moments, and a sword as the sidearm that ties it all together.
Swords also cost more than people assume. Good blades take skilled labor and good material, and not every region or decade has the same access to high-quality steel. A spearhead uses relatively little metal, while a sword needs a long blade of good steel, careful heat treatment, and a sturdy scabbard and belt to carry it. So, when a story or a painting puts a sword front and center, it's often showing status and identity as much as actual battlefield habits. To see the practical reality, you have to look at what works for large numbers of people moving and fighting together. And the first thing that shows up is reach. Number 2. Reach beats style. Once you focus on distance, medieval weapon choices make sense fast. If you can strike first while staying protected by your own line, you're already ahead. That's why the spear was the workhorse weapon for centuries. Calling it simple doesn't mean it was crude or second-rate. It was a smart design that did exactly what armies needed, and medieval commanders kept coming back to it because it was reliable. It's a small metal head on a long shaft, which is far cheaper than a full sword and far easier to produce in bulk. And the wooden part is easy to replace, so a damaged spear can be repaired quickly without a master bladesmith. Just as important, it's easier to train ordinary soldiers to use a spear in a formation than to train them for skilled sword fencing. Most medieval armies were not made of full-time professionals. They were mixtures of household troops, local levies, hired fighters, and noble retinues. Commanders needed weapons that could turn that mix into something usable. A wall of spear points, or later, a dense line of pikes, gives exactly that. A simple, easy-to-follow approach, tight ranks, steady pressure, and spear points aimed toward the enemy. In a packed line, you also run into a basic problem for swords. You need room to swing, and your friends are standing right next to you.
Even a well-trained swordsman can't do much fancy work when he's shoulder to shoulder with a dozen allies. A spear or pike can work with short, controlled thrusts in very tight spaces, and the ranks behind can still contribute by pushing, supporting, and replacing tired men. Long weapons also help against horses. A charging mount doesn't want to run into a hedge of points, and even well-armored riders have trouble forcing their way through disciplined infantry that controls the ground. Many common medieval infantry weapons are basically spear ideas with extra features. Bills and halberds that can hook, push, and pull, or long axes that add chopping power without giving up too much reach. And it's not just infantry. Even knights often started a fight with something long in their hands, because reach is how you survive the first contact. Once you accept that, the next question becomes obvious. What happens when the people you're trying to hit are wrapped in armor?
Number 3. Armor changes everything. Medieval armor, even in its simpler forms, is tougher than people expect. A padded garment under mail can soak up a lot of force and prevent clean cuts, and helmets and shields add more protection on top. As you get into the later Middle Ages, especially the 1300s and 1400s, well-equipped men-at-arms and knights increasingly wore plate pieces, and the richest could afford full plate harnesses. Against that kind of protection, the classic movie move, big slashing swings, just isn't the main solution. A sword can still be dangerous, but it tends to work best either against lightly armored targets or through controlled thrusts into openings, not through chopping straight through metal. That's one reason you see short daggers carried everywhere too. When armor is strong, the fight can shrink down to very small targets. You can even see the design shift in some later swords that are optimized more for stiff thrusting than for wide cutting, sometimes with very narrow blades made for finding openings rather than slicing. And there's a maintenance angle too. Hitting hard metal can chip and ruin a fine edge, while impact weapons are less sensitive to that kind of wear. This reality changes the preferred battlefield tools. Blunt weapons like maces and warhammers can transfer force through armor and shake the person inside. Pole weapons like the poleaxe combine reach with hard impact and leverage, and that makes them especially attractive in late medieval armored fighting. Leverage matters because armored combat often turns into wrestling for control, pushing, pulling, and trying to off-balance someone rather than simply trading cuts. And there's a practical detail people miss. Medieval combat sometimes involved capturing high-status opponents for ransom. That doesn't mean battles were gentle, but it does mean controlling and disabling someone could be just as valuable as killing them.
Hooks, trips, and blunt impact fit that messy reality well. So the sword stays present, but more as the ready-when-needed tool. Now put an armored fighter on a horse, and the logic pushes even harder toward the weapon that was built for that exact job. Number 4. The lance comes first. For the classic mounted knight, the weapon that defines his battlefield role is the lance. A warhorse provides speed and mass, and a long lance lets the rider deliver that mass into the enemy at the moment of contact. That first hit could break a line, knock men down, and create a brief opening where cavalry could push through or force the enemy to scatter. A sword doesn't give the same reach from horseback, and it doesn't deliver that same kind of concentrated shock. On top of that, swinging a sword from a moving horse is not as clean as it looks on screen. Your target is moving, you're moving, other horses are moving, and there are shields, helmets, and spear points everywhere. So the lance, or a long spear-like weapon, stays the priority while the rider has space and momentum. After the charge, lances often broke, got stuck, or became awkward in the crush. Mounted fighting is often a cycle of contact, separation, and regrouping, not one endless ride through the enemy. That's when sidearms matter, and different knights preferred different backups: swords, maces, axes, and sometimes shorter spears. Squires and servants could also bring spare weapons, which makes it even more likely the first weapon in hand was something long. In some late medieval armies, the word lance even starts to mean a small team built around a man-at-arms, because that mounted shock role was so central. Modern images also get mixed up because tournaments were popular and dramatic. Jousting put the lance and the knight on display in a controlled setting, and later art loved that look. But real war was less tidy, and cavalry didn't always get the open ground and timing it needed.
When those conditions disappeared, knights adapted quickly, which is why so many of them ended up fighting on foot in major battles. Number 5. Knights fought dismounted. Many medieval battles, especially from the 1300s onward, involved large numbers of knights and men-at-arms fighting on foot. Sometimes the terrain was too rough, muddy, steep, or crowded for effective charges. Sometimes the enemy set up dense spear formations that made charging extremely risky. And sometimes, commanders simply decided that holding ground in a disciplined line was the safest way to use heavily armored troops. In the 100 Years' War, English men-at-arms often dismounted and fought alongside archers, creating a strong defensive position that punished attackers who had to cross open ground. At Agincourt in 1415, much of the main clash happened with armored men fighting on foot in tight, exhausting conditions, where long weapons and close control mattered more than flashy sword swings. Earlier examples point the same way. Scottish schiltrons at Bannockburn in 1314 showed how spear formations could resist cavalry, and battles like Courtrai in 1302 highlighted what disciplined infantry with long weapons could do against heavily armored nobles. There's also a blunt economic reason for dismounting. War horses were expensive and hard to replace, and once you're in heavy armor, falling from a horse and getting surrounded is a real tactical danger. So sometimes staying on foot is simply safer. Using a horse to get to the battlefield and then choosing to fight on foot could be a sensible way to reduce the risk of losing your most valuable piece of equipment. When knights fought dismounted, their favorite tools often changed. This is also where the label knight can throw people off, because not every heavily armored professional was a knight. Many were men-at-arms, trained fighters equipped like knights, serving nobles, kings, or cities, and fighting in the same formations. The poleaxe becomes a signature weapon of late medieval armored fighting because it offers reach, impact, and leverage in one package. Longer infantry weapons, bills, halberds, pikes, control space and stop rushes, while shields, daggers, and grappling skills handle the moments when everything collapses into close contact. In that kind of environment, a sword is still useful, but it's not usually the first choice if you can keep a longer, more specialized weapon in your hands. And that leads straight into the practical question: when do swords finally take center stage? Number 6. When swords take over. Swords tend to matter most in the moments when distance disappears or plans break down. If your lance is gone, if your pole weapon is knocked away, or if you're suddenly fighting in a space where a long shaft can't move freely, a sword becomes a very sensible tool. It's also the weapon you can carry all day without needing a cart or a spare attendant to manage it, which matters in raids, skirmishes, patrols, and travel. In sieges and assaults, where movement is restricted by walls, gates, and tight entry points, that portability becomes a real advantage. A sword is fast to draw, it works in tight quarters, and it can threaten both lightly armored opponents and the openings of armored ones.
That's why it shows up constantly in medieval sources as part of a complete fighting system, not as the only answer. It's also why different sword styles appear side by side. Earlier knights often carried a one-handed arming sword meant to work with a shield, while later men-at-arms might also train with longer two-handed swords on foot. Even then, a longer sword doesn't automatically replace pole weapons in a mass battle. It's still shorter than a spear, and it still loses the reach contest in a tight formation. Where the sword becomes the star is more often in small group actions, personal combat, and controlled contests like certain duels and tournament foot fights.
Many fight manuals and training texts teach sword work because it builds timing, footwork, and control, and because a sword is a common sidearm across social classes. But those same traditions often spend plenty of time on grappling, daggers, spears, and pole weapons, which tells you what fighters expected to face. Swords also carried meaning beyond pure practicality. They were linked to ceremony, to knighthood, to oaths, and to the public image of honor. A lance is a battlefield tool. A poleaxe is a specialist weapon. But a sword is personal. It's worn, displayed, passed down, and remembered. That cultural weight makes it easy to assume the sword must have been the main weapon in war, even when the tactical reality says otherwise. Number 7. Why we remember swords. The sword dominates modern imagination for a few simple reasons that have nothing to do with battlefield frequency. First, swords survive better than many other weapons. Spear shafts and many pole weapons are mostly wood, and wood decays, while an all-metal sword can sit in an armory, a grave, or a collection for centuries. Second, swords are visually clear. Audience members instantly read a sword as the weapon, while a billhook, a gudendag, or a poleaxe usually needs explanation. Third, later European history kept swords in daily life long after the medieval knight faded away. Early modern soldiers carried swords as sidearms, civilians carried swords in cities, and fencing became a codified art with schools and printed books. That creates a straight cultural line from medieval stories to modern stage combat, so the sword feels like the natural centerpiece. That long afterlife makes the sword feel like the default, even when it was usually the fallback. Fourth, a lot of medieval storytelling was written by and for elites. Chroniclers, poets, and artists focused on the gear that signaled rank, and the sword signaled rank better than a plain spear. Finally, modern film language likes a weapon that looks personal. It's also easier to choreograph and keep readable on camera. The audience can follow a blade, while long pole weapons quickly turn into a confusing forest of shafts. A spear line is about a unit. A sword looks like it belongs to one person. But medieval war was mostly about units, spacing, and who controlled the ground. Seen from that angle, the typical knight is easier to picture with the lance at the start of the action, a longer pole weapon when the fight turns into a packed struggle, and a sword as the constant backup that's ready when everything gets too close for anything else.